Good afternoon, Massachusetts. Thanks to everyone for being here this morning for our international panel. This afternoon, we have a great panel looking at shared lab space. So as everyone knows, Massachusetts is has a presence from 18 of the top 20 large pharma companies, and at most recent count, we had 25 million square feet of lab space. That's great for the state, it's great for the ecosystem, but today we're going to talk about the lifeblood of the ecosystem, which is the early stage companies. So we have a great panel here from people who know what it takes to support early stage companies or are early stage companies. So from my left to right, we have Ashok Chandler, co-founder and CEO of Solanix, Krista Licata, Director of Operations from LabCentral, and Lisa Hemmerly, Director of Economic Development for the City of Cambridge, but also representing the Red Line corridor of Quincy, Braintree, Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville. So to start it out, if each of you could take a turn to give a little bit more of an in-depth bio of yourself and how you relate to the shared space model, that would be great.
I could start off. I developed and invented a technology out of my PhD at Columbia, and so I spent probably a year looking for incubator labs in New York, wore out probably 2 pairs of shoes, walking around Manhattan, and at least in 2012, it was very difficult to come by incubators. So having gone to MIT, I was familiar with the ecosystem up here, so I was like, it's time to move back to Boston. And luckily enough, we were incubated by Mass Challenge, where we got introduced to a number of the incubator options up here. And we settled in the North Shore Innoventures up in Beverly for a number of reasons, which I can go into later. But the technology that we're doing is we have the unique capability of keeping our biopsy cells alive, including prostate, breast, kidney, and lung. And that enables an ex vivo tissue model that can disrupt therapeutic development as well as diagnostics.
I'm Krista Licata, and with LabCentral, we're a launch pad for early stage biotech companies. We house anywhere between 20 and 30 companies at any given time. Our companies come to us and are curated, so they go through an application process, and then once they're accepted, they can move in on a service agreement for 2 years, possibly an extension to a third. We mandate that they have raised less than $7.5 million when they come in, so we're focused on a very specific group. And we have a number of other requirements as well. We've been open for 2.5 years, going on 3, and are doubling our space because we've been oversubscribed in the next month. And in that 2.5 years, our companies have raised collectively more than $1.1 billion and hired more than 700 people, added more than 700 jobs to the local economy. So we're pretty stoked about that and excited to continue to do more of that and continue to be in Cambridge and grow with the crazy community.
Good afternoon, everybody. Lisa Hemmerly. I'm the Director of Economic Development for the City of Cambridge, and we really recognize the fact that our shared lab and office spaces are a vital part of our ecosystem. Cambridge's real estate market right now, we're kind of a victim of our own success. It's probably about $76 a square foot for lab space, and we know that not everybody can afford that, but we really need our small companies to come in and, continue to accelerate innovation, and then, just be the next generation of wonderful ideas for the area. So we're trying to support all of our shared office and lab spaces, and in some ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, through different zoning initiatives and requiring innovation space in our new developments.
Great, thank you. So the Baker-Polito administration is not only focused on growing the ecosystem in Cambridge and Boston, there's a focus on spreading the wealth of the life sciences throughout Massachusetts. We have representation from Worcester here, the Red Line corridor, and a number of other communities. Ashok, could you speak a little bit to the value proposition of being outside of Greater Boston? And Krista and Lisa, if you could speak a little bit to what the shared spaces in Cambridge do for the ecosystem as a whole and potentially continue the growth outside of your respective cities?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start. So when we arrived in Boston, it was 2012, and I don't think LabCentral was there yet. And so we found a home in Beverly for largely it seemed to be a full service, the full service laboratory, North Shore Adventures again. While we got an acceptance to LabCentral, we decided to stay there, largely because it was convenient, one, but two, really we had an opportunity to not just work on one clinical program, given the cost savings and the cost efficiency of being outside of Cambridge. We could develop two clinical programs, and so it was kind of an investment in the company. Sure, it perhaps is a commute depending on where you live, but certainly in an early stage company where you are trying to maximize the value of some technology that either spun out of university or you developed yourself. Certainly, that has a lot of downstream upside. So we were really excited to continue our partnership and work with North Shore Adventures, in as much as it is a full service incubator. It has everything that you would need to not just do biotech, but to do healthcare IT, to do clean tech, to do various levels of biotech, with mass spec, proteomics, genomics, cell-based assays. So there's really no sacrifice other than maybe a longer commute, again, depending on where you live. The community there is actually really tight. There are since we are in the Cummings property, which is a huge property holder in Massachusetts, if you're not familiar with it, there are companies that kind of stay within that, and so it's its own ecosystem as well, where they have offices in Andover and Woburn, and so it is an interesting community. It's not as I guess well known perhaps as Cambridge, but there are a lot of advantages as well.
So I already mentioned, I really believe that the shared spaces are a driver in the economy. It really offers the shared spaces, from a municipal standpoint, offer a point of entry for entrepreneurs that they wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Again, we're talking about $76 a square foot for lab space. We're talking less than 5% vacancy of our 12 million square feet of lab space. So it's just, there's not a lot out there. We are building more. You get to, not only just share your space, your bench, you can share equipment, you can share administration, and, just really cutting your costs that way. And then, you can work with, we're getting, for larger companies, the opportunity to have this kind of bump and connect and find out about new ideas, from these new companies, and possibly become either partners or acquisitions. And so it's just a really great economic tool.
I think just adding to and riffing off of that, so LabCentral is a nonprofit 501c3, and part of our model is to subsidize this space. So in addition to the efficiencies that the companies in our facility are finding to get cheaper rent because they're renting a tiny, tiny little piece of space and then sharing everything else, there's something to be said for the fact that we're charging significantly less per square foot ultimately when you add the service model on top of it, through just efficiency. And that's going to become more and more critical, because it was already mentioned where the success of Cambridge as a hub is going to end up causing more trouble for the startups that built Kendall Square, in that the pricing has become obscene for startups due to the fact that it's attracted all of the pharmaceutical companies that have relocated or elected to pull together into the area. So just sort of anecdotally, LabCentral is in a historic building down on Main Street, old Polaroid building, first telephone call ever made came to our building from Boston. So old building, the only one on the block that stayed because the city wouldn't let anyone tear it down. Everything else around it has been ripped down, and in the amount of time that we've been open at LabCentral, 4 buildings have sprung up around us, and we are now dwarfed by pharma giants. And that is all new, and it's continuing to happen. And so the need for the ecosystem to continue to grow outward and to be modified by that situation is absolutely critical. There's a study, and looked for it this morning and couldn't find it, that specifically used the UK scenario as a sort of case study and said that these types of ecosystems, you've got your mecca center, you've got your hub, and that is critical. The rest of it can't grow without that. At the same time, what's happening out on the edges within commuting distance and even further is just as critical to supporting what it is that's happening in the center. And so it becomes this truly living and breathing ecosystem that's much more than just a neighborhood where everybody comes for tours because of the amount of insane things that are happening within 4 square blocks. And without that, you can't have an ecosystem. So.
Can I just build on that for a second? And I mean, this is part of the reason that we formed the Life Sciences Corridor, because we know that Cambridge can't be everything to everyone. We know that there's not enough room. We have 5% vacancy, and we just can't really build space fast enough right now. And again, it's a good problem to have. We're not complaining about it, but we know that there are more companies that want to come to the area, and we don't want to prevent that. We want to enable that. And so working with other towns that might have different types of space, so you could have your headquarters in Cambridge if you wanted to and have a footprint in Cambridge, but you can do your manufacturing in Braintree or Somerville or Boston or Quincy, or vice versa and things like that, because nobody's going to do manufacturing really in Cambridge. But we still want you to come to the area, and I think those types of regional partnerships are absolutely critical for the continued growth of the area.
Great. Now, Ashok and Krista, this one is a little bit more applicable to you, and it's from different points of view. So Ashok, taking a look at your company, it's a growing company, you're working on a few different programs. What happens when you reach a stage where you may not be a natural fit anymore for this early stage shared space model? And Krista, what happens to the companies that are residents in LabCentral when they may need a few more benches or need a little bit more space, or all of their employees take over the whole shared kitchen?
Yeah, so I think we actually we've been debating on this for 6 months now, whether to expand into our own space, and that's one of the benefits of being in Massachusetts. There's plenty of options, not just within incubators, but full built-out lab spaces, either in Cambridge or Boston, or the surrounding areas. And so I think that decision really is a function of what you want to do and how fast you want to do it. For us, we have our eyes on some lab space so that we can expand. The good thing to that we take solace in the fact that there's the T and there's the commuter rail, and then there's sometimes parking in Cambridge, as long as you have your quarters with you. So there are plenty of times where you can take meetings or even keep an office space in Cambridge and actually have your labs somewhere else. So it's there are many ways to be successful, and I think in terms of growth, I'd be interested to hear what Krista says, but the natural fit isn't to build a lab right next to one of the big pharma players in Cambridge yourself, but to be in the outskirts, I think, is the next big step.
So this is a problem partially, again, precipitated by the creations we're making, and the industry is responding as we build. So at LabCentral and its model, along with other models like it throughout the state, throughout the country, now this kind of turnkey laboratory facility, have changed the game for early stage companies in that they need less money to get started. They can get started with significantly less and run a longer runway with what they have. And that's what everybody gets excited about. That's why the VCs want their companies in these spaces. That's why entrepreneurs want to be in these spaces, because it means they can do more with less money. The problem is that now we're in a position where they're there. They do what they need to do. They still have to go find the huge amount of money to go build out their lab in Cambridge, or to go build out their lab in Waltham, or to go build out their lab wherever it is they want to be. And that's a big issue, because you've changed the state of things, right? You've changed the natural selection process by which these companies are established, funded, and move through what has been the standard system for how many years. So we are actually very actively working on trying to find solutions for companies that I've been friendly in calling our teenagers that need a gap year. They're in a position where they are definitely too big for a facility like LabCentral. They have taken over the cafe. They've taken over the co-working space. They know they're draining our resources and they're putting unfair burden on a community of small companies, and we have those conversations with them openly. And yet at the same time, they have not closed, the $14 million that they need to go build a lab, hire a whole bunch more scientists, put what they need to into infrastructure. And so we're working on what does that next step look like, particularly within Cambridge for companies that need that sort of little bit of additional time. I think it's also changed the type of development that's popping up on the periphery and the edges of Cambridge into towns surrounding like Watertown and et cetera. There are more developers that are now building out spaces that are moderately sized rather than being massive buildings. You can take chunks that are a little bit closer to turnkey, but are still giving company a step up from a true shared facility.
Thank you. One last question before we open it up to questions from the audience, and it's something that's been on our mind at the Life Sciences Center, is how do we take this model of shared facilities, economies of scale, and relate it to different parts of the ecosystem? Do you envision a way in which this could be done for office space for large companies? Could it be done for companies that are doing some manufacturing? Could it be done for CDMOs that are looking to manufacture but don't want to invest everything in their power and their water? Do you envision that as something that could be done in Massachusetts for other aspects of the ecosystem?
I mean, we already have in Cambridge 17 shared office and lab spaces, so it's definitely more coming in the region, so we know it's something that people need and people want, and that the market is already starting to step in and take care of that. And at least, like I said at the beginning, the way that municipalities, government can help is by kind of clearing the road through either, requiring development include some sort of an innovation space through their zoning. We can also do different types of, financial incentives, working with the state, to support those types of activities.
I think in addition to that, I think one of the big pieces that I'm seeing and trends that I'm seeing, and something that I think is only going to continue until we get to a certain point, and I don't know where that point is when the risk starts to weigh itself in, but there's more specialization happening too, where you started with a more general sort of co-working model. Now you have labs. Now you're moving to device labs, and now you're moving to tough tech, and now you're moving, and people are getting much more specific about the sub-industry and subset that they're servicing. Now you're not just doing startups under 7.5 million, now you're doing startups under 7.5 million, you're doing startups within the next category. So you're starting to see a much more intelligent way of parsing up the system in order to better suit the needs. And again, there's research that shows for incubators and accelerators, if you try to be something for everyone, you won't do it well. You're better off to look at a very specific group and say, this is what they need at this stage, and this is how we're going to handle that. Obviously, there's a tipping point. You can only do that for so long until it starts to fall apart on itself. So there's a very academic process by which we have to think about that, and hopefully business will figure that out on its own. But I think that, in my mind, that's sort of the continued next step of that evolution. And it's going to be interesting to see, again, how state continues to define that and help.
I would just, in terms of the trends that I see and what's been on my mind, and even some of the discussions I've been having in the partnering area, investors are getting smarter, and they understand that you can actually build value, and you don't have to throw 20 million at a product or a slide deck or IP to get that there. I mean, incremental value. And so it's kind of touching on your point. There's a space for that proof of concept study. Then there's a space for that clinical validation study, and then there are partners and spaces for clinical utility in terms of or phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And so I think that's really what I find really exciting about being in Massachusetts. I think a lot of people really get that. I remember this old commercial. We did things the hard way. We earned it. Way back when. And so I think there is that culture there where people actually look at the science and take a hard look at the market, and there's actually tangible value there that they're trying to build, but not build it. I wouldn't say too aggressively, but build it smartly and wisely and efficiently, and that's important because there's a lot of opportunities there. There's a huge unmet need in patient care still. Precision medicine, we're just learning that word now. It's still being implemented, and so being more efficient really means having more shots on goal, and more shots on goals means more success. So I think in terms of incubator spaces and the diversity of incubator spaces, to Chris's point, certainly there's a way to kind of, on a stage-wise, stepwise fashion, be really efficient.
Great. Do we have any questions from the audience? Marcus?
If you would go 3 years back, it feels to me LabCentral is there for 10 years, so it has been going super fast. But if you go 3 years back, we're from Chile, we are thinking about building something. What would you do different? What's the one thing you would say, guys, here we made a big mistake, or this is really something you should watch out? What is it?
So the question for those that couldn't hear was, if you can go 3 years back, Marcus is from Chile and they're trying to build something in Chile. What is the one thing you would do to make sure it was a successful innovation ecosystem?
Of course not. Our founders did a really good job of doing their homework because they tested the model for 2 years first. And so I think there's something to be learned from that. Don't just throw a huge amount of money, like $5 million from the state, at a facility and expect that if you build it, they will come. To some extent, that is true, but that's a lot of money to spend building something, hoping people will show up. And so the trial and error and testing and understanding your own industry and your own user group is critical. The number of groups that we have, it's in our impact report. I think it was 70 some international tour groups over the last however many, whatever amount of time, that come and say, I want to build a LabCentral. And it always has to come with that caveat, right? Okay, that's great, but LabCentral exists in Cambridge for a reason, and that's because Cambridge is what it is, and because Boston is what it is. That doesn't mean the model doesn't work other places, because it's being proven that it does, but it has to take into account the regional needs, requirements, strengths. There's some statistics somewhere that out of 14 cities, big world cities, 8 of them want to be in the top 5 biotech hubs in the world. Okay, well, some of those spots are kind of taken and probably not going to be seated very easily. And so 8 want 5 slots, of which probably at least 3 or 4 of are not up for grabs. So if you just think about that, okay? Economic development is great, and finding ways to do it regionally is great, but you have to be really careful and specific about how it is that you're doing it within your community.
If I could just add to that and plug LabCentral as well, what they've done really a great job of is building out a partnership network that's kind of almost seamless. And so I think Chris can talk more about that in detail, but if you think about your region's strengths and whether that be, is it the presence of big pharma to foster innovation, or to foster manufacturing, or to foster specific elements of whatever companies that would be your tenants, they would be interested in. I think beyond just the brick and mortar, I think that's really the success of that fosters the success of any incubator, really. And I think there are a number of examples in Massachusetts about that, not just North Shore Interventures, but in UMass Lowell they have a great incubator, and I mean, maybe you can give a better sense of all the incubators in that.
Absolutely,
yeah.
and that's where I was going to get to with my next point is, next year Bio is in Boston from June 2nd to June 4th. So we invite you all to come, not just for the convention, but come a week beforehand, stay a week afterwards. Make a trip out to Worcester and visit Kevin O'Sullivan. Make a trip up to Beverly and see North Shore Innoventures, because there's a lot to learn from Massachusetts. We have a lot of opportunities for everyone to see what Massachusetts has. So we'd really like to see everyone that's not already from Massachusetts in Massachusetts next year, and we'd be happy to work with you to set up times to see all these sites throughout Massachusetts.
And the other thing that I think successful incubators do is like networking events or just educational events,
Great.
and that builds the community, and that's
Perfect.
what it's about. And
Well, thank you to all the panelists. I appreciate it, and look forward to seeing everyone next year.